September 3, 1944. Somewhere outside Nancy, France. General Major Frederick von Mellenthin pressed his intelligence officer for a second reading of the report. Not because he doubted the man's competence, because he doubted the report's conclusion. American Third Army units advancing toward the Moselle River were operating with a logistical precision that von Mellenthin's own analysts could not fully explain. Supply columns were moving at night without breakdown intervals. Ammunition resupply was reaching forward elements inside 48 hours of request, not 72, not 96. 48. Fuel was arriving before units ran dry, not after. The entire Third Army supply chain was functioning like a single synchronized mechanism, and von Mellenthin, who had studied American operational logistics carefully since North Africa, knew that this was not supposed to be possible. The Germans had a specific, well-documented assessment of American Negro quartermaster and supply formations. Unreliable. Prone to disorganization under pressure. A structural weakness inside the American operational system. That assessment had informed German planning at the corps level since 1943. Von Mellenthin set the report down. Something had changed inside the American Army. Something his intelligence apparatus had not detected. And whatever it was moving supplies to Patton's tanks faster than anything the Wehrmacht had calculated. The question was, what? The United States Army that landed in North Africa in November 1942 carried two wars inside it. The first war was against the Axis. The second war was against its own institutional architecture, a structure of enforced racial separation so deeply embedded that it had its own administrative designation, its own logistics, and its own chain of command specifically designed to maintain it. Army Regulation 21010, reinforced by the Army Service Forces Directives of 1942, mandated segregated facilities across all installations. Mess halls, barracks, recreation areas, medical facilities. The regulation drew no distinction between stateside and overseas postings. You carried the segregation with you across the Atlantic, into North Africa, into Sicily, into France. It traveled in the same ships as the ammunition. The practical military consequence of this system was significant and measurable. Negro soldiers, assigned almost exclusively to service and support roles, quartermaster, engineering, transportation, signal, were commanded by white officers selected partly on the basis of their willingness to enforce institutional separation. Promotion. Pathways for Negro NCOs were narrower, slower, and subject to informal obstruction that no regulation formally prohibited. Training allocations for Negro units were, on average, 14% shorter than comparable white formations in the 1942 mobilization cycle, 14% less preparation than the same combat theater, than the same roads, than the same enemy. By the summer of 1944, as the Third Army drove east across France at a pace that stunned both allies and enemies, Patton's logistical lifeline ran directly through these formations. The Red Ball Express, the emergency trucking operation established on August 25, 1944, to feed the breakout was staffed approximately 75% by Negro drivers operating under conditions of sustained exhaustion, equipment stress, and institutional neglect. And inside that system, a confrontation was building that would determine whether the Third Army's advance continued or stalled. Brigadier General William R. Nichols had a regulation on his side. He had precedent on his side. He had the institutional weight of an army that had maintained segregated mess facilities since 1863 on his side. And in the autumn of 1944, somewhere in the rear echelon of the Third Army's operational zone in France, he intended to use all of it. Nichols commanded a rear area administrative district responsible for coordinating supply flow between the Red Ball Express terminals and Third Army's forward elements. Under his administrative authority sat both white service units and Negro quartermaster battalions, whose drivers were logging, in some cases, 20-hour operational days to keep Patton's tanks moving. The men ate when they could. They slept in their vehicles. They maintained their trucks with tools they had sometimes borrowed, sometimes improvised, and sometimes simply done without. Nichols issued a directive in late September 1944, ordering the physical separation of mess facilities within his district. White soldiers would eat in designated areas. Negro soldiers would eat separately. The directive cited Army Regulation 21010. It was, administratively, entirely correct. It reached Patton's desk within 36 hours. Now, here is the layer that German intelligence never grasped and never could have, because it required understanding not just what Patton believed about tactics, but what he believed about the relationship between a commander's moral authority and his operational effectiveness. Patton did not oppose segregated mess halls primarily because he found them unjust, though the record suggests he did. He opposed them because he understood, with the cold precision of a man who had spent 4 decades studying how armies break, exactly what institutional contempt is to the human beings who are expected to die for the institution expressing that contempt. He had watched it happen. He was not going to watch it happen in his army. What Patton said to Nichols has been reconstructed from multiple sources. The accounts of staff officers present, entries in 3rd Army operational diaries, and the recollection of Colonel Clarence Stayer, Patton's theater medical officer, who witnessed part of the exchange directly. It did not begin quietly. Patton summoned Nichols to his forward command post. He did not send a written response to the mess directive. He did not route his objection through the Judge Advocate General's office or the Army Service Forces administrative chain. He picked up a field telephone and told Nichols to present himself in person. The meeting lasted approximately 25 minutes. What emerged from those 25 minutes was not a policy discussion. It was a lesson in operational reality delivered at the specific volume and vocabulary for which George Patton had become famous across 2 continents. Patton told Nichols 3 things, each one building on the last in a sequence that left no procedural exit. The first thing he said was numerical. He told Nichols that on September 1, 1944, 2 days before the Red Ball Express reached its single-day operational peak of 5,958 vehicle trips, his forward armor had been running on fuel reserves of less than 1 combat day. Less than 1 day. The margin between the Third Army's advance and a complete operational halt was being held by the Negro drivers of the quartermaster battalions grinding their 2.5-ton cargo trucks down French roads at 2 o'clock in the morning. Patton told Nichols that a man who drives a truck for 20 hours to keep your tanks moving is not a second-class soldier. He is the reason your tanks are still moving. And Patton told Nichols that any administrative action which communicated to those men that the army they were bleeding for regarded them as unworthy of eating beside their fellow soldiers would cost the Third Army more operationally than a German division. The second thing Patton said was personal. Among the Negro quartermaster units operating under Nichols's administrative district was the 3912th Quartermaster Truck Company, whose first sergeant was a man named Calvin Weston. No relation to the Corporal James Weston at Ordruff, though the coincidence of name is striking. First Sergeant Calvin Weston had been driving the Red Ball routes since August 26, 1944. He had logged, by late September, over 11,000 miles in 34 days. His maintenance records showed 0 vehicle abandonment. Every truck that left his company's motor pool under his supervision had returned or been formally recovered and repaired. 0. In a theater where the average vehicle abandonment rate on the Red Ball routes ran at approximately 4% per operational week, Weston's record was, by any objective military measure, extraordinary. Patton knew this because he had read the operational reports. All of them. Every night. That was not posturing. That was how Patton commanded. He told Nichols that First Sergeant Calvin Weston had earned the right to eat anywhere in the Third Army's operational zone. And then, he told Nichols something that reframed the entire argument in terms no regulation could answer. He said, "You are not protecting an administrative standard. You are telling the best motor sergeant in this theater that his country thinks less of him than the man whose tank he just fueled. And when he hears that, and he will hear it, because armies are not deaf, you will have taken something from him that no mess hall can give back. You will have taken the belief that what he does matters to the people he does it for." The third thing Patton said was the one that Nichols had no procedural response to. Patton told him that the mess directive was rescinded, effective immediately, not reviewed. Not referred to higher authority, rescinded, and that any officer under Patton's command who reissued a similar directive under any regulatory justification would be relieved of command before the ink dried. Nichols left the command post and did not reissue the directive. But the story did not end there, because what Patton did next was the part that changed the operational calculus in ways that Friedrich von Mellenthin's intelligence section would spend the following weeks trying to explain. Patton did not stop at rescinding one directive from one brigadier general. He understood, with the strategic intelligence that separated him from commanders who won battles but lost campaigns, that a single order does not rebuild what institutional contempt has corroded. You cannot tell men they matter with one memo and expect them to believe it. You demonstrate it, repeatedly, in ways that cost you something visible. On October 4, 1944, Patton visited the motor pool of the 3912th Quartermaster Truck Company near Verdun. He did not announce the visit in advance. He arrived with a single aide and walked the vehicle lines for 40 minutes. He stopped at trucks. He asked technical questions. He examined maintenance logs. He spoke with drivers by name, not by rank, by name, because he read the operational reports and the names were in them. First Sergeant Calvin Weston met him at the third vehicle line. The two men spoke for approximately 8 minutes. Patton examined the undercarriage of a 2.5-ton cargo truck that Weston had. Flagged for a cracked differential housing, a defect that, left unrepaired, would have caused a breakdown on the next operational run and potentially blocked a critical supply route for 6 to 8 hours. Patton asked Weston how he had found it. Weston said he had heard a frequency change in the drivetrain vibration during the previous run, a shift of perhaps 3 cycles that no instrument would have registered, but that 20,000 miles of driving had taught him to recognize. Patton stood up from the undercarriage. Inspection, looked at Weston directly, and told him, in the specific, unadorned language that Patton used when he was being completely serious and not performing, that kind of knowledge was worth more to the Third Army than a field commission. Word of that exchange moved through the quartermaster battalions within 48 hours, not because anyone officially communicated it, because armies talk, because soldiers know when a commander has looked at what they do and understood its value. The operational consequence was measurable within 2 weeks. Vehicle availability rates across the Negro quartermaster battalions in 3rd Army's operational zone rose from an average of 78% in September 1944 to 89% in October, an 11 percentage point increase in the same units, on the same roads, with no new equipment, no additional maintenance personnel, and no change in operational tempo. The variable that changed was the belief, now documented and demonstrated, rather than merely asserted, that the command structure considered their performance worth noticing. Von Mellenthin's intelligence section noted the improvement in American supply efficiency in their October 12 operational assessment. They attributed it to equipment upgrades or route optimization. They did not have a category for what had actually happened. Their intelligence framework had no mechanism for measuring what a commander's visible respect is to the operational output of men who had previously been given every institutional reason to believe their effort was invisible. The Germans had a word for combat spirit, Kampfgeist. They measured it in their own formations obsessively. They had no equivalent measurement for the logistical formations they regarded as secondary. That gap in their analysis cost them the ability to predict American supply performance accurately for the remainder of the campaign. The evidence accumulates at every level of analysis. Start with the battlefield. The Third Army's advance from the Seine to the German border, August 26 through mid-September 1944, covered approximately 400 miles in less than 3 weeks. No army in the European theater on either side had moved that distance at that speed in that period. The logistical feat that made it possible was the Red Ball Express, which, at its operational peak on September 1, delivered 12,342 tons of supplies to forward elements in a single day. 75% of those tons moved in trucks driven by Negro soldiers. The advance did not happen without them. It is not possible to construct an alternate history of the Third Armies. Breakout that removes the Negro quartermaster formations and preserves the operational result. The statistical proof is equally unambiguous. The 11 percentage point vehicle availability increase between September and October 1944 in 3rd Army's Negro quartermaster units represented, in practical terms, approximately 340 additional operational vehicles per day across the fleet. At the Red Ball Express's average payload of 5 tons per vehicle per run, that translated to roughly 1,700 additional tons of supplies per day. Reaching forward elements. In a theater where the margin between advance and halt was measured in single combat days of fuel and ammunition, 1,700 tons per day was not a marginal improvement. It was a strategic asset. The enemy testimony comes from von Mellenthin himself in his post-war memoir, Panzer Battles, published in 1956. Von Mellenthin wrote that the American logistical performance in the autumn of 1944 had exceeded every German estimate and that German operational planning in the Lorraine campaign had been built on supply assumptions that proved consistently wrong. He identified American logistical flexibility as a decisive operational factor. He did not know its source. He could not have known, from his vantage point, that part of its source was a 25-minute conversation between an American general and a brigadier who had tried to separate a mess hall. Long-term impact. The integrated operational practice that Patton enforced in the Third Army's rear echelon in the autumn of 1944 became a documented case study in the files of the Army Service Forces after the war. Those files informed the deliberations that preceded President Harry Truman's Executive Order 9981 on July 26, 1948, which formally desegregated the United States Armed Forces. The order cited operational efficiency explicitly, not merely moral principle, but the documented military cost of suppressing the capability of soldiers on the basis of race. Patton did not live to see it. He died December 21, 1945. The order came 2.5 years later. Here is the counterintuitive truth that this story carries. Every German operational assessment of American capability in 1944 was built on a model that assumed the American Army's racial segregation was a permanent structural feature, a fixed weakness that German planning could rely on. An army divided against itself, the model held, will always underperform its theoretical maximum. The Germans were correct about the principle. They were wrong about Patton's willingness to tolerate the division. When Patton rescinded Nichols's mess directive and walked the motor pool of the 3912th Quartermaster Truck Company and stood under a truck with Calvin Weston to look at a cracked differential housing, he was not performing generosity. He was performing command. He was closing a capability gap that his enemy had built into their calculations. He was, in the most precise military sense, denying the Wehrmacht an intelligence asset, the reliable prediction that American supply performance would be constrained by the institutional contempt his army showed its own soldiers. The universal principle is not complicated. An institution that tells some of its members their contribution is less visible, less valued, less worthy of recognition, will get exactly the contribution it signals it expects. No more. Capability suppressed does not disappear. It goes somewhere. Sometimes it goes to the enemy side of the ledger in the form of a predictable operational weakness. Sometimes it goes to waste in the form of a first sergeant who stops listening for differential frequencies because no one has ever told him that listening matters. Patton told Calvin Weston it mattered in front of other soldiers at a motor pool near Verdun on a cold October morning in 1944. 11 percentage points, 1,700 tons per day. That is what respect costs. That is what contempt wastes. And somewhere in the records of Friedrich von Mellenthin's intelligence section, the unexplained improvement in American supply efficiency sits in a file unattributed forever. He never found the answer. It was standing in a motor pool. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe the channel.